Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So today we're going to talk about some flags. The North Carolina flag. We're going to talk about that a lot today. We're going to talk about the American flag as well here at the start. And a lot of time on the North Carolina flag because as simple as this looks, it's wrong. All right, cool stuff to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. So the American flag has symbolism. Flags in general have symbolism, and I want to spend some time today talking about the symbolism between the two flags here. All right. So the American flag is pretty straightforward. It's pretty commonly well known. The interpretation of the flag has pretty much remained the same over the course of our country. So really, after 1776, we had to create a flag. And the different parts of the flag, a lot of them have remained the same. So the horizontal stripes on the American flag, there's 13 of them. There are 7 red stripes and 6 white stripes, makes 13. Those 13 stripes represent the original 13 colonies, and that's why there's 13 there. The red stripes represent hardiness and valor. The white stripes represent purity and innocence. Now, that might seem crazy in today's society. You're like, purity and innocence. But that's a throwback to the religious fundamentalism that helped found the country. The blue behind the stars represents vigilance, perseverance, and justice. The stars, and this is probably the one, hopefully you already know. If you don't, that's fine. Each star represents the current states in the United States. So the flag throughout history has gradually changed. While the stripes remain the same, the size remain the same, the meanings of the red stripes and white stripes remain the same. The thing that does change over time are the stars. As we add more states, we get more stars. So it used to be like the round 13 stars, and as you added states, you added stars. So if we ever added a 51st state, like Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. Puerto Rico, at this moment when this is being recorded, is the most likely next state of the United States if we added a 51st. And if that happened, it would we would have to rearrange the stars, I would reckon, to come up with 51. All right, so the question is, what part of the flag would be most likely to change over time? Talking about the American flag. What would have to happen, all right, and what would change in the flag? Like, what would have to change in America in order for us to be like, we got to change the flag, and we just talked about it. And then what part of the flag would change, which is literally the first part of the question as well. All right, so answer that, and we're moving on. All right. North Carolina flag. Now, the red, the white, whatever, we'll talk about the kind of backwards way North Carolina has done flags. I should go ahead and point out that North Carolina doesn't even have a flag for the first 90 years of its existence as an actual state. 80 years. It's not until the Civil War, 1861, that North Carolina gets a flag, and it's not even this one. All right. So North Carolina is way behind the times, a lot of it. And we're going to talk a lot about the dates that are on this flag. There's 2 dates on this flag. What do they mean? Well, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the May 20th, 1775 date, because that story is ridiculous that date is on the flag, in my opinion, and I'm going to poke a hornet's nest, which is also a North Carolina reference with the Revolutionary War. But because while history backs me up on this, it's going to irritate some people in North Carolina who still believe that May 20th, 1775 actually symbolizes what they think it does. And there's no history to back it up. All right. But let's talk about the legit one, all right, before I throw stones here. April 12th, 1776, all right? So April 12th, 1776, that is a real date, all right? I mean, obviously, they're both real dates, but what it symbolizes is something very important, all right? So we're going to talk about that one first. So So April 12th, 1776 represents the Halifax Resolves. So 1776, that was an important date. That ends up being the Declaration of Independence, which is going to be signed on July 4th, 1776. So the Halifax Resolves takes place in Halifax, North Carolina, in which they realize it's about time, because we're still a colony, North Carolina's still a colony, it is about time to deal with Great Britain, fight back, deal with this in an absolute fashion, all right? So, but nobody really knows what's going to happen, because there's getting ready to be a thing called the Second Continental Congress, where all the states have to meet together and decide what they want to do. North Carolina meets ourselves as North Carolina, and we're like, all right, what do we want to do? And the Halifax Resolves are really important. They say, hey, we are absolutely going to send delegates to the Second Continental Congress. And you know what? We're going to go ahead and support independence. So North Carolina really is one of the very first states that says, look, not only are we going to send you, we're going to go ahead and tell you when we send you here what we want you to say, that we're done with Great Britain. All right. Most states basically sent delegates and is like, y'all kind of, get a feel for the room and decide what we should do as a whole. The Halifax Resolves from North Carolina said, no, when you show up, you go ahead and support independence. That's what North Carolina wants. All right. So at the Second Continental Congress, when North Carolina shows up and there's a vote, yes, everybody else is going to vote as well for independence. But North Carolina is the only one that really shows up with a directive from the state saying, yeah, we are voting for independence. You can't vote for other ways. So the Halifax Resolves are really important because it really does put North Carolina kind of out front here, right? It's a little, a little bit of a paper trail, but because of that, all right, because of April 12th, 1776, before the Declaration of Independence, North Carolina sent people that were going to go talk about the Declaration of Independence and already told them we need to be pushing for independence, all right? So that is why the license plates today in North Carolina, legitimately so, say First in Freedom, and you can see that date above it, April 12th, 1776, all right? There's also that date, May 20th, 1775. Mr. Wagstaff, what's that date? We're going to talk about that date. But first, the question is, what is so significant about the Halifax Resolves, which is the April 12th, 1776 date that's on the North Carolina flag? Why is that important? That is a real event, real thing that happened. Why is that important in North Carolina history? So answer that completely, and we'll move on. All right. So this is one of those weird situations that somebody's going to be really grumpy, and probably a lot of people are really grumpy over this lesson because I'm going to counteract things that have been said for hundreds of years in North Carolina. Because things got said and people are like, well, that's history and it's fact. And it's not. Now, with that being said, right, if I am proved wrong, I will be the first to admit it wrong because this entire situation makes my home state where I was born and raised look ridiculous. Honestly, is the best present day. So I would love to be proved wrong on this with my with what I'm getting ready to say. But I'm going to give you all the information and you make your own opinion. And is this all make-believe? All right? Has to do with that first date, May 20th, 1775. So before we can talk about May 20th, 1775, I got to give you a little backstory to North Carolina. Before I can even give you a backstory to North Carolina, I got to give you a story to this backstory of North Carolina, which is Rip Van Winkle. So you may be familiar with this children's story. You may not be. The story of Rip Van Winkle, it's kind of dark. Guy goes out in the middle of the woods. He's a farmer. All right, he's got a wife and kids. And he goes out into the woods and in the Catskill Mountains in New York. Again, this is a fictional book. And he meets some dwarves that give him something to drink. And he's like, okay, random dwarves, let me drink this random drink you gave me. And then he falls asleep. And Rip Van Winkle falls asleep in the woods for 20 years. He wakes up and says, oh, what is going on? So this is in the 1700s when this story takes place. He was like, oh, well, what has happened? What is that? He's got a long white beard now. He's 20 years older. He's like, oh my gosh. So he goes home, and this is where the story, like, there's no reason to make it this dark. Washington Irving, he wrote this. He wrote a couple other famous stories as well. But he gets home and his wife is dead. It's been 20 years. His children are grown, and he's just like an old man. But what has happened is he fell asleep before the Revolutionary War and woke up, and the whole America has changed. And like, there's a picture of George Washington on the wall instead of King George. And he's basically slept for 20 years and missed a bunch of stuff. All right, so that's the story of Rip Van Winkle. All right, famous children's story. The reason that's really important now is North Carolina gets nicknamed by the rest of the country the Rip Van Winkle State. That's what the rest of the country calls North Carolina in the 1800s. All right. So North Carolina is referred to as the Rip Van Winkle State. Now the reason that is because North Carolina was committed to small government and an agrarian economy. We had zero public education in North Carolina in the 1800s. None. We just didn't do it. Nope. We had no education. We had no desire for economic growth. We had basically no methods of transportation. We just didn't decide. And it wasn't that we couldn't. We just didn't want to. Didn't care. And while the Virginia, South Carolina, they're all getting better, getting more advanced. North Carolina just doesn't care. We stay out of politics generally. We don't get involved in national affairs. We're just like, nah, don't care. So we are made fun of by the rest of the country. After the Declaration of Independence and America becomes its country, everybody's like trying to get better. North Carolina's like, whatever. And we fall so far behind as a state that we get nicknamed the Rip Van Winkle State. Because it's like we're asleep at the wheel. All right? So the question here is, before we move on with this story, how do you think North Carolina felt about the nickname Rip Van Winkle State? And why was North Carolina referred to as the Rip Van Winkle State in the 1800s? So pause me, answer that completely, and we're moving on. Now, show you this picture. Guys, his name's Nathaniel Macon. And this is a picture of his home. Nathaniel Macon is a senator for the United States government. He represents North Carolina. He's a senator for the U.S. government. All right. He's got a nice little painting here. They went out and took a picture of his house. Keep in mind, the first governor of North Carolina doesn't even have a picture, not even a sketch. Couldn't find one. But Nathaniel Macon absolutely got a painting of him. This dude must have been very famous. Well, he was. And a college professor, when I was in grad school, and we talked about this in depth, he made a good analogy, and it's kind of stuck with me. When you are made fun of long enough for not being able to do something, and then you decide, hey, I want to be able to do it. Sometimes human perspective is you overreact to it. You overcompensate. All right? And I'm going to have to, from my studies, it looks like what is going to happen here. Because North Carolina, all of a sudden, all right, in 1819, decides, you know what, I no longer want to be considered the Rip Van Winkle State, I guess. And Nathaniel Macon comes out. And in 1819, he's like, whoa, everybody. And North Carolina's like, what is this? What's going on? He's like, I just discovered something. And they're like, what is it? He's like, did you know that, because the Declaration of Independence at this point, so it's 1819. This is 44 years later, all right? This is 44 years later after the Declaration of Independence, or 43 years after the Declaration of Independence, that everybody thinks the Declaration of Independence is the greatest thing ever, is what led to our country. He goes, did you know? Yeah, the Declaration of Independence is awesome and all, but did you know that North Carolina actually declared independence from England a year before America did? That North Carolina said, we're independent from you. And everybody's like, what? And he's like, yeah. And he writes this in the newspaper. And it's called the Mecklenburg which is where Charlotte, the city of Charlotte is in Mecklenburg County, so it's in the area of Charlotte. He's like, yeah, it's called the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And all these guys got together on May 20th, 1775, and declared their independence from England. And everybody's like, that's crazy. I was like, yeah, we're not the Rip Van Winkle State. We're actually cutting edge. We actually declared our independence an entire year before anybody else did. And North Carolina's like, that's fantastic. Pat ourselves on the back. Oh man, we love ourselves. This is fantastic. Nobody goes and like actually checks where Nathaniel Macon got any of this information from or where this came up from. But everybody just believes it because that sounds awesome. Great. Wonderful. Look how great North Carolina is. We pat ourselves. We love ourselves so much. But it really helped America or North Carolina confidence because we're not useless. We're actually, more advanced than everybody else. So the question here is, why was the discovery of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence such an exciting find for the Rip Van Winkle State? Like why was that so exciting when we discovered this in 1819? So answer that completely. And then we're going to move on. Pause me if you need to. All right. So doesn't take long that people are like, wait a minute. Are you telling me that North Carolina had the first Declaration of Independence? They're like, yeah. The Rip Van Winkle State? And they're like, yeah. And everybody's like, all right. Like, people got other stuff going on. It's during the era of good feelings, whatever. Nobody really even questions this. So when nobody questions it, it kind of becomes like, hey, yeah, this is a legit thing. Absolutely. Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, fantastic. So where fuel gets thrown on this fire at is two guys. Thomas Jefferson, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams. Both of these men are presidents. At this point, it's in the 1820s. They're both retired. They're actually both going to die, and this is crazy. Random fact here of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who both helped write the Declaration of Independence. They end up both being presidents, but they don't like each other. They end up being very much political rivals, even though they're both founders of the country. They both die on the same day, which is weird in itself. But they, on opposite sides of the country of old age, they both die on July 4th, 1826, the exact 50-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They both die, which is crazy in and of itself. But the spitefulness here is really interesting, which brings in the questions of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. So John Adams, all right, and Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but Thomas Jefferson really gets all the credit for it, and we talked about him in this class. He gets a lot of credit for writing the Declaration of Independence. John Adams, kind of egotistical, kind of bothered him that Thomas Jefferson got all the credit for it. So he sees in the newspaper, that North Carolina is claiming they actually wrote the Declaration of Independence a year before Thomas Jefferson, with the help of John Adams, actually wrote it. And John Adams is like, what? Like, you would think the men who wrote the real Declaration of Independence would be like, hey, anybody else already declared independence from this? So John Adams is like, wait a minute. This seems like some bull. So he cuts it out of the newspaper and mails it to Thomas Jefferson just to get Thomas Jefferson worked up, just to see what he says. Like, he's like, hey, these guys say they did it before you. He's literally like out of spite, just to kind of poke Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's an old man at the time. And Thomas Jefferson's like, dude, it's a hoax. That's not real. Like, we desperately wanted to see if anybody had done this before. Like, we would have nobody ever mentioned it. Nobody ever is not a real thing. It's complete make-believe. Now, the reason it's interesting here is these are private letters between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. So this isn't published in a newspaper. He doesn't come out and be like, it's a hoax. Like, he's just like, whatever, let them do whatever they want. Like, it's America, who cares, all right? Well, when they both die a few years later, all these letters, which are super important to the rest of the country, and everybody goes through and reads these letters and they're like, wait a minute. Thomas Jefferson calls bullcrap on the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. So they go back, all right, to Macon, the guy who found it, and said, hey, just to clarify this, what happened? And here's what Nathaniel Macon says happens. He says, yeah. So, yeah, and they're like, so do you have it? And he's like, no, I don't actually have the Declaration of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. So what happened? Oh, this is crazy. So it like burned in a fire in 1800. And they're like, what? He's like, yeah, it was in this random cabin, and it burst into flames. Now keep in mind, this is 24 years after, or 25 years after it apparently had been signed in 1800, and it was just sitting in a cabin somewhere. Okay, whatever. And the cabin burns down and it burns the cabin. Okay, well then, how do we know what happened? He's like, well, there's a dude that was there, all right? Dr. Alexander. Dr. Alexander, he was there and he recalled from memory what happened. And they're like, okay, cool. All right, so where's that dude at? Can we go talk to him? No, you can't talk to him. He's dead now. Okay, so we don't have a copy of it. We have no recollection that it ever existed to begin with, except for a random word of a guy that died. So what in the world do you have written down here? He's like, well, Dr. Alexander remembered it, and he told his son, William Alexander, what it was, and William Alexander wrote it down. Okay. Where's William Alexander at? I don't have any idea. How do you have it? He sent it to me in the mail. Senator Macon, are you telling us your entire basis for this fact that North Carolina was cutting edge of the entire Revolutionary War is based on something that got written by the son of a guy who's recalling something from memory 30 years after it happened, who claims he was there, yet there's zero evidence this ever happened? Yes, that's what I'm saying. You would think North Carolina's response is, come on, man. North Carolina's response, like, it's good enough for us. And North Carolina just, that's enough fact that it happened for North Carolina to fully commit to it. Now, here's something which is odd that is being completely lost in history. Something called the Mecklenburg Resolves. This is a real thing that happened May 31st, 1775, 11 days after the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. The Mecklenburg Resolves were actually a real meeting that took place because North Carolina was pretty irritated with Britain and basically said, Britain, you better know your role around here. Like, they're not declaring independence, but they're basically saying, you need to stop stepping on our toes. We're not going to do X, Y, and Z for you anymore. Just stop it. So the Mecklenburg Resolves really is a North Carolina step standing up to Britain. But the problem is, you can't acknowledge the Mecklenburg Resolves and simultaneously acknowledge the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. Because why? If you had just 11 days earlier declared your full-on independence from England, would you then 11 days later come around and be like, hey, for real, you need to know your role, England. You just declared your independence 11 days earlier. So the Mecklenburg Resolves are very important in American history, but we don't talk about that. And we choose not to talk about it in North Carolina history because if you acknowledge the Mecklenburg Resolves and what they said, it completely contradicts that 11 days prior to that, you completely rejected Britain as a whole. You know what I'm saying? Like you wouldn't break up with somebody and then talk about relationship problems 11 days later if you're already not a thing anymore. So the Mecklenburg Resolves are a real thing, and there is some question. What if the Alexander family was confusing May 31st, 1775, and they're trying to rewrite that one from memory? Because those documents do get lost, and they don't come out until the 1830s. So when the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence is found, nobody knows about the Mecklenburg Resolves either at the time. Those documents were found years later, which is a real thing. The Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, there's a school of thought and a theory that maybe North Carolina and these guys had confused the two and just kind of made it up with the idea of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote in his mind. But regardless, North Carolina takes that May 20th, 1775 and runs with it. When they make the North Carolina flag for the first time, and this is the first North Carolina flag, crazy, top of May 20th, 1775. America declares their independence. The second date is May 20th, 1861. Notice how the May 20th line up here. That's a big reason they went with the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence that was in question, but not the Mecklenburg Resolves, which is a real thing, or the Halifax Resolves, which are also really important. Because the May 20th line up, because the May 20th, 1861, that's the day that North Carolina seceded from the United States and joined the Confederacy in the Civil War. That is when North Carolina had to create our first flag. And the two dates, the Declaration declaring their independence from England, all right, because you don't want to do the other ones because that's all connecting with either England or America that you're leaving. And then the second date is when North Carolina left the United States of America. Well, Civil War isn't going to go well for North Carolina or the South. The South loses in the Civil War. The Confederate States of America are disbanded, and North Carolina is forced to come back in. Well, North Carolina's like, I like this whole having a flag thing. So North Carolina changes their flag from this to this of what we have today, and they change the second date, the secession of the United States, from May 20th, 1861 to April 12th, 1776, which is the Halifax Resolves, where North Carolina sends people to the Second Continental Congress with the rule they're supposed to declare independence, which is a legit thing. But they keep the top one. May 20th, 1775, and it's still there today, representing something that historically there is no evidence it ever happened, and it looks a lot like North Carolina tried to overcompensate for being made fun of for being the Rip Van Winkle State by making up an entire situation in which North Carolina is not only equal to everybody else, we're superior. We did it a year before, and Thomas Jefferson called him out on it, and it is still to this day. They still have what's called Mech Deck Day in Charlotte. It used to be a state holiday, and now they've backed away from that because they're like, yeah, we can't really support this. But it is still on our flag. It is still acknowledged as a real event by anybody who does zero historical research on it. Now, if somebody can prove me wrong, I'll be more than happy to make a whole new video here. But it's got to be historical evidence. If they come out and they fight, man, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm wrong because this is my state. I hope I'm wrong. I'm not. We have hundreds of years of looking for this. It's make-believe. Didn't happen. So the question here is, do you think the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence date, why do you think it's still on the flag present day? Why do you think it is still there? What's its purpose? Why don't we change it? All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. And that's it.